at the end of the day, whether you know exactly what to do or you don't, the only person that is holding you accountable for it is yourself.
It's so amorphous and so untethered that there isn't really that feedback. You're just doing your thing and that's it.
There's an ego killing aspect of religion and spirituality that needs to take place.
There are very destructive ways of ego killing. There's very destructive forms of religion and spirituality that break people down. And there's very helpful medicinal ways of getting outside of one's ego, right?
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Good People, episode 12. Today, I was joined by Ame Wren. She is currently studying to get her PhD in American religion from the University of Virginia. She is also the owner of Boston Yoga School. In today's episode, we talked about the spiritual but not religious community, what the differences are between being spiritual and experiencing wonder, and if spirituality is something that happens to you or if it is an active process. Before we begin, if you are watching on YouTube, please like, comment, and subscribe, and turn on post notifications so you never miss an episode. I really enjoy this conversation. I hope you guys get something out of it. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to the show. Thank you for taking part in this immersive listening experience. A meaningful existence is a moving target that, no matter how close, will always be out of reach. We hope this message finds you with an outstretched hand. As we attempt to uncover complex truths, remember, life's toughest questions can be answered if we all just focus on one thing: being good people.
Ame Wren, welcome to the show. Thanks for doing this.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So I'm very excited for this. This is a topic that I am extremely interested in myself. But before we begin, can you tell us, me, the listeners, a little bit about yourself? What is your educational background and what is it that you study and how you became interested in it?
Sure. Let's see. Well, I have sort of two paths that have merged. So I'll tell you a little bit about both. Academically, when I was entering college, I entered as an English literature major. I was really interested in being a writer. And upon some various happenstance type circumstances, I took a religious studies class and became very fascinated and changed my major a couple of weeks in to philosophy and religion. So that was my first, I'd say, introduction to this topic, was when I was an undergrad. And then I went on to do a master's in cultural studies where I focused on gender and religion. And then I went on to do further graduate work in sociology of religion. And now I'm doing further graduate work in American religion at the University of Virginia. And then along the way, I started teaching, and I used to teach at UMass when I lived in Boston, and now I teach at JMU. And then in addition, when I was in college, I grew up without any spirituality or religion in my life. My parents were both atheists, agnostics, uninterested type people. And when I was in college, I started doing yoga and getting into meditation, and I became a yoga teacher while I was in graduate school the first time. So for the past, I don't actually know how many years it's been anymore, maybe 16 or 17 years. I've been teaching yoga, and I run a yoga school as well as my academic pursuits. So my interest in this topic has come through both of those paths, both the academic look at such phenomenon and also my own experience through yoga and meditation.
Awesome. And I think that something you said that was cool is I went to college I was a communications major. I'm a fitness coach now, but I found writing in college, and I was a creative writing major. So it's cool that you were trying to be a writer and did something else. And I sort of stumbled upon writing on accident. I wouldn't consider myself a writer at all. And I'm not really pursuing that, but that's just fun and cool for me.
Yeah. And, my path still has a lot of writing in it, but I was very similar to you. I was interested in creative writing when I first got to college, and that's what I was really into when I was in high school. And my path now is more academic writing, but it's still writing, and I still love writing. It's nice to have a bit of a subject and not be responsible for the creative aspect anymore.
Yeah. Would you say so contemporary religion is sort of this overarching thing, yoga, there's a little bit of, I guess my question here is, if you could talk a little bit on what is under the umbrella of contemporary religion.
Oh gosh, yeah. I mean, it's really a vague term because it refers to traditional religions too. Contemporary just means of the now. So, um, more institutionalized and historical and what we would call traditional religions are under that umbrella as well, because if they're still going, they're contemporary. Um, but I think that what's happened in a huge way in the past couple of generations is an interest in this concept of spirituality, which I know we're going to get into. And so contemporary religion could mean contemporary forms of Catholicism or Islam or the more canon based religions, or it could mean someone who's interested in yoga and meditation, or it could mean so many other things, which I know we're going to get into. So it just means of the now, what's present for religion and spirituality.
That like spiritual but not religious community, that's something a lot of people say now, right? And my first question, I guess, is have you been able to pinpoint when people started, I guess, using that term? Because I mean, pretty much everybody who's my age that I know is like, well, I'm spiritual, not religious. And I know we're going to get into what that means and what it is, but is there a specific time period when people started saying that?
It's a great question because people tend to think it's something that's very new, but it's actually not. The earliest instances of it we can trace all the way back to the early 20th century with the Transcendentalists and people like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau and a little known person named Ralph Waldo Trine. Some of these people were in the midst of exploring what it meant to seek meaning outside of the traditional institutionalized church. And so while the term as it's understood now maybe wasn't used in the exact same way, like the SBNR logo and that sort of thing, the concept is actually well over 100 years old. In addition to the Transcendentalists and some of those early 20th century thinkers, the AA world started using that term I believe in the 1940s. The Big Book has that term in it. And so people that were getting involved with AA and as that movement was starting to build momentum were using that term almost 100 years ago. So it's gained a lot of popularity in the past, well, really since the 1960s, but in another new push way in the past 20 years. It goes back a lot longer than you might think. And the
That's very
idea
interesting.
is the idea is not new. The idea to seek outside of the bounds of a church is not new, even if the moniker of SBNR is new-ish.
Yeah, and I think if I had to guess before you said that, I would have probably said something around like the late 70s or 80s. And it sounds like it was obviously even before that, but just with hippies and that sort of movement, that in my head is like, okay, that makes sense that that would be sometime around there. But that's very interesting. I guess that makes sense when you think about, if anybody listening is familiar with any of those individuals' works, it sort of makes sense that it's very in line with that sort of thinking. How is this
Yeah, I tend
different?
to. Oh,
Go
pardon.
ahead.
I was going to say, I tend to think of it as having kind of booms throughout American history. And so the Transcendentalist is kind of the first big boom of people thinking outside the church box. And then the 1960s and 70s, as you noted, is kind of another one. And then we see another one in the 1990s and early 2000s that has continued to today. So we can kind of track it as having cultural currency for over 100 years, but having these kind of moments of intense popularity.
Yeah, and I think I guess I have two questions off of this, and the second one will depend on the first one. Is this a worldwide thing? Because um, it feels very non-Christian in a way, or I don't want to say non-Christian because that's not true. I don't know exactly the term that I'm looking for. It seems like people who are spiritual, not religious, pull from many different things and their experience and the experience of others and this text and this text. And so it's not necessarily non-Christian, but maybe there's this underlying Christian foundation with hints of Eastern stuff like yoga or whatever mixed in, right? And so is the spiritual, non-religious thing specific to uh, maybe is there like an underlying Christian philosophy? Is it a worldwide thing and it kind of just depends? What is that?
It's a good question. It's hard to answer. I would say that there's an overwhelming American flavor to it. And so it's much, 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 much more an American phenomenon than anywhere else in the world. And if you look at the stats, in this country, traditional institutionalized religious affiliation is going down. In fact, just last week there was a new stat release that said it's dropped. Church affiliation has dropped below 50% for the first time, and since they've been tracking, basically. Whereas in other parts of the world, in much of Africa and parts of Asia and much of South America, religion is on an incline, and people are actually becoming more religiously affiliated, and religious movements are being accepted with fervor, let's say, whereas they're being rejected in this country. But then we also have places like Western Europe and Australia and things like that that tend to trend similarly to us. So in Western Europe, there's especially in the UK, there's a similar interest in SBNR and spiritual not religious, and then also in Australia. So we don't actually know, or at least to my knowledge, we don't know whether that term has cultural currency in countries outside of the US, Australia, Western Europe area. There's a lot of places where it probably wouldn't even make sense of it as a question, because religion is so baked into the culture that it's not something that would be separated the way that it's been separated in American culture as like, oh, we're this, but we're not this. So I will say that it's hard to know if it's global. There haven't been any robust studies done on how global the terminology is, but I would definitely say that it is a primarily American concept. To your question about Christianity, given the Christian roots of this country and given the overwhelming Protestant language that's baked into so many conversations about spirituality, I would say there is a flavor. There's certainly a flavor of Christianity in the SBNR ideals, because if we look back to the Protestant Reformation and the idea that you can have a personal God, spiritual but not religious is an outgrowth of that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And are there any specific characteristics that differentiate SPNR from a more traditional religion like Christianity that you've been able to nail down or can point to?
Yeah, I mean, there's a tremendous amount. SBNR is very amorphous in that people from all sorts of backgrounds and practicing all sorts of things could say that they're spiritual, but not religious. But there are some commonalities. I mean, one of the major ones I just spoke to is that it's personal. It's a personal, often independent pursuit, something that is one's individual seeking and individual picking and choosing from various sources and rituals and practices and ideas and so on. So it's very much a personal spirituality, and sometimes a personal understanding of what God is, or higher power, or the universe. People use lots of language in this day and age to describe a similar concept. It also tends to be pretty anti-establishment and anti-institution. So there aren't SBNR churches out there. There aren't, at least not to my knowledge. There are groups of people that identify as that moniker that are doing things together, but you're not going to walk down a city street and see like the Church of the Spiritual but not religious. That's not going to happen. So there's a resistance to authority and institution and anti-establishment, and all of that comes right out of the Transcendentalists, because that was very much their story as well. In addition, there's not a lot of dogma. There isn't a code, there isn't a creed, there isn't a book, there isn't a way that you have to be if you conceive of yourself as being spiritual but not religious. You can really do anything under that idea. There are no boundaries. Oftentimes, people who go to church also say that they're spiritual but not religious. And what that might mean is that they attend for reasons of family or community or ritual or history or something like that, but they don't actually subscribe necessarily to all of the beliefs and the morals and the creeds of that particular church. So it's really wide scope. In addition, I would say that the SBNR logo, one of the things that people have in common that qualify themselves is that there's a very pluralistic worldview. And what I mean is that folks can look out at all the different religious paths and the spiritual paths and see a multitude of truth, and to each his own, essentially, as a motto, like, well, if that's your thing, then more power to you. That's a general attitude versus some more dogmatic traditions that might say that another path is inherently wrong or incorrect. The SBNR crowd tends to be accepting of all paths, even if they aren't pursuing it themselves. There's also not necessarily a way to be when you're spiritual but not religious. It's a search, it's a seeking, it's an openness to experience, and so it can just look so many different ways, which you can't quite say of more traditional paths of religion.
I would say that's probably one of the benefits, and again, you can confirm or deny what I'm about to say, but that's probably one of the most clear benefits to me of, like, if I look at an individual that subscribes to a more traditional religious approach where it's very cookie cutter and cut out, it's like, this is the way to be, where because of the more individualized way of thinking that SPNR provides an individual, and, maybe those people have given thought to a set of values that they have, whether it's super clear or not, but at the end of the day, whether you know exactly what to do or you don't, the only person that is holding you accountable for it is yourself, which makes it a little bit more tricky and challenging to feel content in the way that you are living your life in a sense.
Yeah. And I mean, that's one of the benefits and pitfalls, in the same breath, is that because it's so individualized, it can be very personally fulfilling, and without any sort of structure or community to reflect back at you. One of the criticisms of the SBNR trend is that it's self-serving and that it doesn't actually do what religion is supposed to do, according to some folks, which is that it's meant to be a mirror. It's meant to be a place where you reflect on how you could be a better person in the world. And it's meant to be some place where you get feedback. And in an SBNR community, it's so amorphous and so untethered that there isn't really that feedback. You're just doing your thing, and that's it. You're doing whatever motivates you.
Yeah. What is something that a lot of my friends or peers say when I have these types of conversations is, like, very in line with what you were saying earlier. I don't believe in organized religion. I kind of do my own thing. And something that I find personally, I don't want to say frustrating, I don't really give this much thought other than it's just always intrigued me, is there's a clear difference to me between spirituality and experiencing the feeling of wonder. And I think that sometimes people get those things confused. This is a very blanket statement, but there's a very generalized version of an individual that is, I don't believe in organized religion. I kind of just do my own thing. And it always feels like a cop out to me that they aren't willing to do deep work to uncover some of these universal things that we're all sort of seeking when we have this discussion. Is this something that you observe?
Yeah. And, I'll say that if we were to have a pros and cons list of religion and spirituality, I mean, one of the pros of religion is that it's an organized path, right? So there is a sense of, this is what you do. According to this, whether it's according to Jesus or according to the Buddha or whatever, this is what you do to accomplish this. And so with spirituality as its own concept, divorced from any formalized system, there is a conflation, I think, of spirituality with all sorts of things. Wonder is often also described as a sense of awe or transcendence and this sort of thing. And humans of all stripes experience that. And there's various moments in life where you often experience it, whether it's having a child or something in nature that is awe-inspiring, or tragedy is often awe-inspiring, seeing something terrible happen in the world and having a moment of perspective, or feeling insignificant, right? That can also be a moment of awe. So to your question, is experiencing wonder, spirit, like, how do they relate experiencing wonder to spirituality? I would say that experiencing wonder could be a part of spirituality, right? If you have it, if you stop for a moment and look at the world and think, am I allowed to swear?
You can swear. You can say whatever you want.
Yeah. Okay. If you stop and say, holy shit, what is happening? Look at what is happening. Like literally just look at a tree and the birds and the sky and and then the people in the infrastructure. I mean, it's wild when you zoom out, and having those moments can be an isolated experience. You can have that moment and then you can go right back to your Twitter feed or whatever else you were doing, right? And it cannot last. But someone who is pursuing a spiritual path, I think potentially is trying to access that more often, more regularly, so that it becomes a way of changing oneself, right? Checking in with one sense of wonder or one sense of awe, and letting that be the mirror, so to speak, of that isn't there for you necessarily in the spiritual path. That moment of perspective of I am small and insignificant and I'm self-obsessed because that's the human condition. So how do I get out of that? Well, maybe I seek out experiences where I'm sensing wonder and awe and perspective and so on. So I don't know if they're necessarily the same or just one is part of the other. And I think to your point, if you're just kind of randomly putting efforts into things without any cohesion, it would be hard to say that that's a real spiritual path. It might just be some spiritual exercise.
Gotcha. I like that answer a lot. And I think if I could add my own anecdotal evidence to it, there's a little bit of it's looking and seeking for wonder, but also reflecting on past wonder, I think is very helpful too. And I'll give you an example. One of the ways that I've sort of gone on this path of self-discovery for myself is I've done a handful of ultra marathons, and I just last September ran 100 miles. And there was a moment, it was like 51 or 2 miles in. It was right at the turnaround point. Have you been to Reddish Knob? Do you know where that is?
No.
Okay. It's one of the highest points in Virginia. It's a 45-minute drive from Harrisonburg. We started wherever we started, and this was the halfway point. We ran to the top. This was one of the highest points in Virginia, and it was 2 hours after the sun had come up, and I'm looking over this lush green valley, and I'm kind of on death's door because I just ran for, 16 hours or whatever it was, and I was exhausted. And so I was very at a heightened senses sort of phase where everything was just profound already. But being at a moment like that, I was experiencing wonder at a very high degree. And that was a really cool, weird feeling of like, at the time I was like, I'm only halfway done. This is going to take even longer to get back. This is horrible. But upon reflecting on that moment, I have taken a lot out of that moment specifically and the whole experience in totality. But I think the wonder feeling is a very important part of spirituality for me, but even more so reflecting on some of those experiences of wonder and sort of over time getting something new from it each time is a path to understanding that spiritual side of yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really cogent point, because as you were describing that feeling, I remember a feeling like that. For me, I was there when my father passed away. He was ill and he was in the hospital, and he and my family were there when he actually died. And that was a moment in the opposite end of the spectrum, right? Like not so much a moment of wonder, a moment of deep contemplation, watching someone's body give out, right? And it's a moment that I have come back to over and over and over and over again. This was 3 years ago, where I think of it all the time because it was so impactful. And so to your point, those things are baked into one's spiritual practice, potentially, that reflecting back on momentous experiences.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Are there any like certain characteristics for spirituality in general that maybe somebody who's seeking to look out for, seeking to develop this side of themselves, are there any characteristics that you feel like people could look for to start looking?
Well, I mean, you kind of answered it in your question, which is the idea of seeking, the idea of looking, the idea of discovery. And so one has to be motivated. There's a famous scholar, Clifford Geertz, who describes religion as the moods and motivations of people. And so for one to pursue a path, I can't imagine it's that different than training for an ultra marathon. You have to practice and you have to keep doing things that enable whatever it is you're trying to find. So the seeking is the number one thing, I think. And people find that so many ways. I mean, I think meditation is having a moment culturally right now. There's so many meditation apps. People are so into it. It's being marketed now. I think we're going to get to that later, but that's a way that people find spirituality in their lives. Yoga or other forms of physical activity are often a way. Things like running to your experience, nature, community, service. And then I would also say that there are practices now that are stemming out of organized religion that aren't necessarily part of organized religion alone. So I think of prayer, for example. It's a staggering amount of people when they do polls that pray. And when you put the amount of people who pray up against the amount of people who have religious affiliation, it doesn't match at all. And so prayer is something that has become a spiritual practice. And whether you're praying to a Christian God or you're praying to the universe or you're praying to Mother Nature, the act of prayer is now a thing that has a lot of traction, and people do it and they don't even realize they're doing it. So that's something I think about, but also writing, having rituals, collective experience is often a spiritual experience for people now. Another definition of religion is collective effervescence, from Emile Durkheim, and that describes the feeling that people get when they're in an energetic experience with other people. And so sometimes you might look at a sporting event as a religious experience for people or a spiritual experience because there's such an energy and it's so intense and it's so connected and it builds and so on and so forth. And people become very committed to it. So those are other ways. But I think that if you're trying to begin a spiritual path or something, it starts by asking yourself questions. What am I looking for? What do I hope to gain? What do I feel like I'm lacking? What brings me to myself? What brings me to others? These are questions that I think when you sit with them and you meditate literally or figuratively on them, the answers can then send you into the direction you need to go. Right. And so for me, I'm a movement person. I've been a yoga practitioner for 20 something years now. And then I'm also really into fitness. And that is often the way I can find myself and I can be a better wife and a better mother and a better sister and a friend and all of those things. Like when I move, literally move, I am cleared. Right. Mm-hmm. And so for me, that's part of my spiritual practice is physiological movement and health. For others, it might be intense meditation sits. I have a friend who just became a Zen priest, and for him, those long sits of contemplation and the quiet and the rigor of coming back to the breath over and over and over again, that's his path. So I think it depends on the person, but those are just some ideas.
I think something that makes a lot of sense to me is that something that you said there of prayer. I think that we all kind of have this innate thing inside us that just we want to look and ask and seek things. I'll give you a good example. Imagine you're on a plane full of a bunch of different people with different religious affiliations or non-religious affiliations, and the plane starts going down. Somebody will be praying to God. Somebody will be praying to Allah. Somebody will be asking the universe to make sure they're okay. Somebody will say out loud, who doesn't believe in God at all, man, I really hope I make it out of this. All and in a way, that's prayer in a sense too. And so I think in line with what you were saying that was really ringing true for me is that I use the spirituality side of things for everybody is is an innate thing that we all seek. And the action of looking that you're kind of describing is enough for people to get started. And really this is something that probably takes place our whole lives, right? We'll never really find what we're quote unquote looking for. It's the action of it.
Yeah, and I'm reminded of David Foster Wallace's famous speech, "This is Water," where he says everybody worships, and he tells a story. And I won't retell it. You can go listen to it. It's a fantastic commencement speech. But he tells a story about two people, having an experience of prayer, kind of what you're saying about the plane, and seeing it as completely different, right? But maybe it's actually the same ultimately, and they're both doing the thing, right, where they're looking and looking elsewhere and trying to find answers and trying to find assistance. And the way that they go about it is so wildly different that if we just take, a really far look at it, doesn't seem like the same thing. But then when you zoom in, as David Foster Wallace said, everybody worships, it just looks different for each of us.
Yeah. That's one of my, I listen to that probably twice a year. And if anybody who's listening hasn't given that a listen, like, I cannot stop this podcast right now, pause it, and go listen to it right now, because it's very beautiful and impactful, and it's exactly what we're talking about, but spoken in a very eloquent way. So 100% I agree with you.
Yeah, put it in the show notes.
Yeah, I'll put it in the show notes. Good call. I know we've kind of been talking about this, but just to be a little bit more specific and clear, do you feel like spirituality is something that just kind of happens to you through a lived experience, or does it need to be intentional and active?
I think, I'm going to start to sound redundant here, but I think it depends. Like the last thing, it depends, because I think it's both. There are certainly instances, many, many, many instances, well documented, of people having spontaneous spiritual experiences, mystical experiences, visitations from God or from a spiritual being or something like that, and then their path being changed. Often people who do psychedelics reflect on this as well, that the experience of being in that altered state changes them forever. And then, there's a spiritual quality that comes out of it. So there's that. And then there's people like me, it's totally the opposite, where I had to work at it. I had to work because, like I said, my upbringing, I had nothing even vaguely spiritual or religious in my consciousness. And when I started doing yoga, I really resisted that element of it. I was like, I'm just here to work out. I'm just here to stretch. I wasn't interested. And so when I started to, I don't know, I suppose grow up, as you do, as you progress through your 20s, right? I started to see that I was a really selfish person. And most of us are. But I started to see that I needed to do something about that. And so my spiritual path started as a self-development path and then expanded. And so for me, it was very much an active thing. I went on meditation retreats. I read texts. I studied with teachers. I tried to do as much experimenting as I could, within reason, of course, to figure out what worked for me and what spoke to me. But I think for other folks, it's totally the opposite, where it just happens. You just you have a transcendent experience and you're forever changed, or you have a near death experience, is another place people experience it. And you feel God, and then you never stop feeling God, and so there's such a spectrum. And I wonder if there's a correlation to various personality types, like I wonder if we took the Enneagram and put it up against people's active or passive spiritual pursuits, if there would be any correlation. I don't know, but I think it's both.
I am really glad you said that. I would be very curious about that as well, because similarly to you, I'm exactly the same. I mean, I grew up in a Christian household for the most part. We went to a Presbyterian church. We went very, very often when I was young, and then I started playing soccer, and my games were on Sunday, and then all of a sudden we just started going less and less, and now we're the Easter and Christmas family, or at least I am. And my dad goes more, I think, or the most out of everybody in my family. My little brother goes with him pretty often, but very similarly, I've kind of always just had it at a distance from me, because it's not that I didn't care about it when I was younger. was always, I don't know about this. Like, I don't know if I can think about this just yet, sort of deal. And I don't know if I actively was aware of that thought process, but looking back, that's definitely sort of how I felt. It was just like I'm worried about other things. And similarly, probably, I guess it was selfish because it was like, why would I worry about this when I could play video games or play soccer or whatever?
Mm-hmm.
But it is so hard for me to figure all this out. My grandma is somebody who she would tell me she would just have a nightmare about a plane going down, and she would wake up in the morning and there's a plane just crashed on the TV, right? Or she saw these two little people, little boy and girl in a Civil War outfit, sitting on a bench at a rest stop, and then she got distracted and looked back and they were gone. Like, this is a woman who's very in tune with that sort of thing. And I believe her. Like, she's not, my grandma's not going to lie to me. I believe that these are things that she's experiencing. And there's hundreds of instances like that she's told me about. And I'm somebody who, the paranormal and spiritual stuff just doesn't happen to me. I don't have that. I'm not on that frequency. And I've always, like I said, I use these ultra marathons to find this part of myself. I've always been disappointed by the outcomes of them in this regard, because there's some ultra marathoner, I don't remember his name and I don't remember exactly how it goes, but it's something of like, if you want to run a 5K, if you want to challenge yourself, run a marathon, and if you want to talk to God, run 100 miles, right?
Was it David Goggins? That sounds like something David Goggins would say.
I
don't know.
think it was David Goggins, but if it was anyway. David Goggins, he would have said, motherfucker, run 100 miles. But that's just not my experience. Like, this moment at 50 miles, yes, I was aware in the moment that I was looking out on this profound thing and I was really experiencing something wild that very few people will get to experience. But I was also like, man, I'm really tired and I just want to get this thing over with. Like, this is horrible, And I don't ever get to the second win portion of the run where people describe they feel God and the universe around them sort of lifting them up and giving them more energy and spirit. I don't have that. It's just horrible and I feel awful the whole time, right? And I look back on those moments and I think to myself, they are pretty profound in those ways. I just don't have I'm a very realistic guy. I'm very, this is what it is. I've trained for this. This is what's supposed to happen, sort of thing. And so, similar to what I said earlier, looking back is those points of spirituality and reflection for me, but I definitely do not have an easy time myself feeling those experiences. And when I do, my brain resorts to like, no, this is happening because of this. It's very
logical,
dyadic, I guess, in that way, where there's always a cause and effect, and this is just the effect of something that is happening to me physically.
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting reflection because, as you were saying that, what was coming up for me is layers of connectivity, and so like you use the word frequency, it's a great word for it. Like your grandmother is on a different frequency where she's tuned in to things that perhaps you and I aren't tuned into. And but I think that like both experiences, whether it's your grandmother sort of having a flash of something that then happens and some sort of extrasensory perception type thing, or you having your profound experience halfway through that ultra marathon, the way that you each download that is different, but perhaps the essence is the same. It's hard to say, but perhaps your sense of profundity at the halfway point of your ultra marathon, it didn't last for you, as you said, but you had it for a moment. And so is that similar to your grandmother having a profound dream that then has great meaning to her? I like I said too, there's a personality aspect to it, because if you're trained to be rational, which most of us in this culture are, and we're trained to trust science over everything, and we're trained to only deal in the literal and not spend time with the metaphorical and the ethereal and the esoteric and so on. All of that trains us just like anything else. Like the nurture of this culture on most people is that we are not trained to be dialed in to other realms or to each other or to nature or to anything. We're trained to be dialed into one thing, ourselves and our productivity. And some folks naturally find a way out of that, like your grandmother, or maybe never fall into it would be a better way to describe it. And others get swept up in the American dream of you just work and you work and you work and you get stuff and you get more stuff, and that's the secret. As opposed to, well, actually, the secret might be connection, getting out of oneself, as opposed to becoming more self-interested. Anyway, I'm
What
just
is it
spitballing.
about spirituality and religion? I guess I'm sort of talking my way to this question. You mentioned psychedelics earlier. Something I've never done psychedelics, but something that people who do them say is there's this universality to it, right? Where you tap into this universal consciousness. And many of those people feel like that is what happens when we die. We join this universal consciousness. And, people will look at that. I would say anybody who doesn't prescribe to that belief kind of looks at it like a hokey dokey woo woo type stuff, right? But I mean, in an essence, that's what everybody's doing in a way where whether it's right now in our current lives or when you go to some other plane when you die, the point of it seems to be the very like community tapped into other people. It's not about you, it's about the whole sort of thing. So whether it's we literally join this universal consciousness and our spirit and energy joins it when we die, or you are volunteering at a food bank with your church, it seems there's a universality to spirituality that I see and feels pretty consistent across the board. Is that true?
Yeah, and I think that concept of interconnection is often how it's described. The concept of interconnection, like there is no distinction really between me and you or me and anything else. That concept is both a big one for this new bubble of spirituality that we're within, and it's one that lots of traditional religions, especially things like Buddhism and Hinduism, speak to at large, which is that there is actually no divide, but we perceive a divide. That's sort of our fatal flaw as a human, is that we live our lives as if we're divided, but we're really not. And so it's certainly it's a quality of spirituality. You mentioned psychedelics. That is often that's like the number one thing people who have done psychedelics speak to. Ram Dass was very famous for talking about this, about that everything is connected and all the boundaries fall away, and you just see yourself as part of a whole, and you see everybody as part of the whole, and you love everyone in this overwhelming way. This great sense of compassion can come from that. And so I think that, the people who are thinking that that's woo woo, to use your term, right, or resistant to that idea, are more of a product of our current age, which is our current age is very focused on brand and self-identity and self-pursuit, and definitely not focused on how can I connect to others. I mean, there is very little of that in reality. And so people have lost touch with it, but there have been a lot of studies about the happiest people in the world and those sorts of things. And one of the most profound things across the board, culture to culture to culture, is that the people who are the happiest and have the most meaning in their life are the people who are regularly in community, interacting with others, giving to others, doing service. It doesn't have to be formal service like a soup kitchen. It can be neighbor to neighbor, sibling to sibling, just a sense of, I am not the center of the universe. This goes back to David Foster Wallace, right? How do I get myself back to remembering that I am not the center of the universe? And one of the most straightforward ways is to help others and to help people regularly, not once a month for 2 hours. I think psychedelics is maybe a shortcut to that feeling, but it's a similar feeling.
Yeah, I trained a Presbyterian pastor, and I've had this conversation briefly with him, but we were talking about wonder similarly to what we were talking about earlier, and he was sort of in agreement of wonder being a big part of it, but he kind of settled on this idea, and I don't remember how he worded it exactly, but I really agree with what he said, and the sentiment of it was, you said you are not the center. There's an ego killing aspect of religion and spirituality that needs to take place. That's what ultra marathoning provides. That's what a lot of my hobbies provide me. I do jujitsu a lot, and jujitsu is another one where it's a humbling experience. It makes you feel, it either makes you feel like you're just as good as everybody else, or it makes you feel like you're not as good as you think you are and everybody else is the same as you. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I'll say, I'm a little ahead of you in life, and I have an 8-month-old son, and parenting is an ego killing experience as well, and so I think that's a really great way to describe a lot of things, because there are very destructive ways of ego killing. There's very destructive forms of religion and spirituality that break people down. And there's very helpful medicinal ways of getting outside of one's ego, right? And you're going to be dealt that in life no matter what. So if you're making a spiritual practice out of getting out of oneself, I would argue that you're better prepared for when life serves you tragedy, devastation, etc., because then you're like, well, it's not about me, and this is a reminder. So why don't I motivate toward the whole instead of motivate toward the self, right? So yeah, I think that ego eradication idea is something that's very much across the board.
Do you think that experiencing that ego killing is a thing that people, it's not for like, not everybody is willing to run 100 miles, right? If I take a very realistic productivity approach as a coach for somebody, I would say something along the lines of like, you have your quote unquote purpose. I know not everybody's fortunate enough to feel like they have something like that, right? But there's a thing that you feel like you would be willing to suffer through, and usually that craft or task or mission is it has an ego killing aspect to it, whether it's running an ultramarathon or being a painter or being a chef, etc. There's a thing that you feel willing to give yourself to. I might have just answered the question there, but is that something that everybody just has at an individual level, and it's a combination of personality and genetics and chance and culture that they grew up in? Or is there a certain realm of things that people should be pursuing?
I don't know if I have an answer, but I think it's a really interesting question, because I was thinking as you were saying, like my own experience having had a child recently, and being someone who spent much of my youth and early adulthood not thinking I was going to have children, and now I have one, and it's been the experience that we're describing, but I didn't like plan for that. I didn't think that I had no sense. Like when you go run an ultra marathon, you're going to get the shit beat out of you, right? And I like maybe knew that parenting was hard because that's what people say, but I didn't actually know what it meant to totally sacrifice yourself for another being and be completely thrilled to do it, which has been my experience of parenting. And so I'd say that, like, for some people, my husband, I think, is much more somebody who's always known what drives him and has for a long time been very clear about that. Whereas I wasn't that person. I was someone where it kind of had to, it goes back to this active passive question you asked me a few minutes ago. I was someone where it had to kind of happen to me in order for me to sense that drive and that mission and that purpose. And I feel it now, but I didn't feel it in my youth, whereas my husband's someone who definitely did. So I think it depends. Again, it's an it depends question.
Yeah. And I think, to touch on my experience, and my answer is the same, it depends, but more specifically, some things just happen to you, right? And they shape who we are and what we're interested in. I was an overweight kid that was interested in video games, and I had a lot of friends, like people that liked me okay, but I wasn't super close with anybody, right? And I've never talked to a therapist about this, and maybe I should, but I'm a fitness coach now, and I really like talking to people and learning things from people. And that's pretty much the opposite of who I was when I was young. And so, like, some people I've always known I was going to play in the MLB and hit baseballs for a living since they were a little boy, right? And others, there's a saying, I don't even know how it goes, but it's like you become the person that could have helped you as a young individual. That's who I am. Like if I had me when I was young, I would have been I think I would have felt way better about everything going on. Somebody to simultaneously be like, hey man, everything's going to turn out okay. You're going to be all right. But here are the skills that you're going to need and the roadmap that you're going to need to get to where you want to go, et cetera. So I think, it seems like you and I are very similar in the sense that, I've always just kind of done things because it's never with an excited, I'm made to do this. It's like, okay, well, I guess I have to do this thing now. Like, we'll see how it goes, sort of thing.
That's such an interesting reflection. And I've never thought about that, but I would say the same is true. Whereas like if I had me as a kid, me now as a kid, as some sort of mentor, yeah, things would have gone better in my, junior high and high school days, which were a bunch of suffering for me. And so that's such an interesting reflection. I mean, it's also interesting that you say like you've had these experiences where like, okay, well, this has become the path for me. And I've sort of been like, all right, I got to do this. I mean, certain people would say that that's a God intervention. And you and I probably wouldn't put that language on it, but it speaks again to how there's a commonality in human experience. It's what we source it to that seems to be so wildly different, right? Because for you, it sounds like it was, a sense of duty where you were like, all right, I got to do this. I'm going to go follow this path because here it is. And I was similar, like teaching in all the various forms, yoga and academically and so on. Teaching became the path where I was like, okay, this keeps showing up. So I'm going to go do the thing that seems to be the thing I'm supposed to do. Right. But I'm certain that there's someone out there that would tell me that was just God's plan. Right. And
Yeah.
so
And I
it's an
think
interesting similarity. Yeah.
I was going to say, you said that word like God intervention, and I would 100% agree that that's what it was, in the sense of, I always have this. Have you read Matthew McConaughey's book, Green Lights?
I have not. I did listen to a podcast of him talking about it though, so I'm vaguely familiar.
Okay. I think you would really enjoy that book, in terms of, I was really taken off guard with how introspective he is as a guy. And I think he kept a journal from 15 years old to 50 years old. And then this whole book, especially if you come from a creative writing background, it's a memoir of his life, but it's, there's pictures of him growing up. There's pictures of him doing a float down some river in Africa. There's entries from his journal. And so it's a very cool creative memoir in that sense. But there's something in the book, and this isn't even like a thing he wrote. It was a screenshot or a scanned copy of one of his notebook pages, and I could barely read it, but there was this little note off in the corner that has always stuck with me from that book. And it was, if you believe in luck, you believe in God. And I remember I was reading it and I read that line, and then I just reflected on that for, I don't know how long it was, a couple minutes maybe, but I wrote it in my journal because it kind of took me off guard, in the sense of like, that's stupid. That doesn't make sense. And then I thought about it more, and I was like, no, this is kind of how I feel inside of this, spiritual, not religious. And I feel comfortable talking about this, is something that I identify with as myself, right? I grew up in a Christian family. I seek God, love, luck, whatever in my life all the time. And it's something that I think is important to pursue for me as an individual. And so that whole, it's just happenstance and chance that I decided to sign up for an ultra marathon. I decided to get certified in CrossFit to train people. I decided to send an email to the one gym that was just so happened to looking for coaches. And then I just so happened to ask the owner if I could coach for them full time. And then they needed extra help, so she said yes. And I just so happened to have met Cayman, the guy who's, you can't see, but he's sitting next to the camera, who is a videographer by trade. And we get along okay. And it seemed like a cool idea that we wanted to do this thing. And since then we've made this podcast and had this cool relationship with each other and have a lot of interesting things in common. And so one individual would say that that's a whole bunch of cool coincidences that have gotten me this point. My grandfather would say, God has put me on this path and I'm living up to my purpose and potential. And it's literally all just because I just did the next thing that sounded interesting and fun and cool to me. And I followed it until it ended. And then I moved on to something else. And that's kind of how I'm here. So 100%, I think the God, coincidence, instance, intervention is all the same, no matter how you word it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a famous parable. It's like we're all looking at the moon trying to describe the same thing and we're using different language, and so like there's a mysterious mysterium tremendum is another. Rudolph Otto describes religion that way. It's like there is a mystery, right, to human existence and the way that we work, and the fact that we have this intense amount of consciousness that, as far as we know, no other mammals have, right? There's a mystery and there's an intensity to our experience that is unexplainable to some, explainable to others, but the experience of the mystery is there regardless, right? So if you're getting your answers from the Torah, or if you're getting your answers from an ultra marathon, or anything in between, you're both asking similar questions. Why are we here? What is the meaning of this? What am I supposed to do while I'm here? How do I make the best out of it? And so on and so forth. And these are the eternal, I would say, universal questions of humanity. And then the way that people ask them and the way that people explore them looks so different from person to person, culture to culture, time to time. But yeah, I think that we're talking about the same stuff.
Yeah. Are you familiar with Dante's Wager? I think it's called.
Not off the top of my head, no.
Okay, I think it's Dante's Wager. I might be wrong on that. It's somebody's wager, but the idea is, if you live your life like there's a heaven and hell or a God, right, and you die, you will be rewarded. But if there's not a heaven and hell and no God, at least you lived a productive, good life.
Oh, yes, I have heard this. I don't know if it's Dante either, but I've definitely heard that. So I know the concept.
Okay. It sounds like there is what you were just talking about, that statement feels true, right? Whether or not there is heaven or hell, you're going to live a good life. But on another level, it's not just a good life in the sense that you were good to people and you helped others. There's a little bit of selfishness there too, is if you live a life seeking these things, looking for God, like there's a heaven and hell, you will feel more fulfilled inside. You will feel more connected. You will feel more in line with whether it's your purpose or not, the things that you enjoy doing.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you need the heaven and hell labels as much as just the practice of asking good questions, right? That you'll feel more connected and you'll feel like you have more meaning, and you'll feel, there's no shortage of evidence now about all the things that disconnect us, such as, social media and video games and, like stuff like that, technology, etc. Not podcast technology, obviously, but but there's no shortage of evidence of all the things that the modern world does to disconnect us. And when people find ways of connecting to whatever that thing is, the God, the concept, the practice, the community, etc., they're better off. They're happier, they're healthier, they're more fulfilled, and less likely to suffer from depression, anxiety, malaise, etc.
This is sort of taking a step back with talking about spiritual, not religious community and sort of where this comes from. But it seems like there's a big impact of this, maybe specifically from Eastern culture, yoga, meditation, any sort of self-exploration like that, from media in general. Influencers on social media, there's pop culture. We all gravitate towards that sort of spiritual, not religious thing because of the diversity of opinion, etc. I think a couple examples would be like celebrities that talk about it, business people that have like routines for themselves. I see this as sort of they say I'm doing this to be more productive, but a morning routine that sets your mind and body right for the day is a very obvious form of mindfulness, spirituality in a sense, even if you don't think of it in that way. And athletes, they look for quote unquote flow state when they perform and train and things like that. Does this connection between our culture and a diverse array of ideas involving spirituality contribute to the spiritual, not religious community getting so much bigger?
There's a lot to unpack there. And it's a bit of a chicken and an egg question, because did the, market capital forces get word that spirituality has become hip and then start feeding it to people? Or did people start looking for things? And, it's hard to say what came first. And is it the seekers creating the demand and then people responding with the supply, or is it you know what I'm saying? Like it's hard to parse. As far as, Instagrammers and, online gurus and these sorts of things, I wonder about those things because I see them as promoting an idea of spiritual materialism where, oh, well, if you want to be spiritual, then you've got to do this, morning routine that I concocted. And so in order to get access to my morning routine, you've got to sign up for my thing that costs this much money. And you've got to, and to me, and I'm potentially unpopular in this opinion, I think that's a bunch of bullshit, because I think that spirituality is about you connecting to yourself and to others by way of the things that you deem meaningful. And so I don't think any influencer is going to tell you what that is. And while you might get ideas for practices, like I think the meditation app craze is cool because more people have access to meditation, which is an ancient practice. And great. Now they have a way to do it that feels organized for them and is familiar because it's an app and we all know how to use apps. And I don't know, I struggle with being bombarded on social media by ads telling me I should pause and meditate, because if I need to pause and meditate, then what the hell am I doing on social media? There's a strange relationship happening. So I'm not sure if I'm really answering your question because I have a lot of opinions about this stuff, but I don't like the intersection of capitalistic marketing forces and spirituality. To me, it's antithetical. Now, I might sound like a Luddite saying that, and you're just so old and disconnected from how people get information today. Maybe that's true. And maybe the things that come through various internet sources are jumping off points for people, in which case that's all they are. You learn about a thing from whatever influencer and then you go and you explore it yourself and it's really great. Okay, fine. But if you're reliant on someone else to tell you what your spirituality looks like, to me, that doesn't strike as spirituality. Something about that strikes as contradictory.
I think, and it's many things, but in a nutshell, because I'm very in line with this way of thinking. 100% I'm on board with you. And I'm somebody who I'm going to post 3 clips from this episode on my Instagram,
and then my social media team is going to repost them. So
yeah, I'm going to tag you in and you're going to repost it. And then your followers, hopefully I'll get a couple followers from you and they'll start listening to my podcast. And then, totally. One day I'll be able to talk about athletic greens and how they're a great product. And then I get paid,
right. And then some of your listeners are going to take my online yoga class. And yeah, I mean, this is how it works. You can't get outside of it now. If you're having these conversations in this space, like we are doing the thing that we're criticizing. Yes.
But I think the difference is, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this. What we get frustrated with is an abandonment of values. And I'll give you a good example. I believe that information is free. If I'm a fitness coach, if somebody at jiu-jitsu asks me to look at their workout program, 100%, yes, I'll take 30 minutes. I'll be home late to dinner. I will look at your program because I want to help you. It's this thing that I have. And if I give that to you, I'm useful to you and I can help you and you're going to live a better life because of it. Where we get frustrated is when somebody talks about the importance of helping people and then they use that same line of thinking of this is one of my values. And then they sort of create this arbitrary new value of like, you shouldn't feel bad for being wealthy as like a justification to themselves that they can sort of take a twist on some of those things and make money off of it. Like, I really want to help people, right? And what I value is my coaching from a fitness perspective, right? And so I'm not gonna go and train somebody on my free time, right? I can't do that. That's just not feasible, especially with the society that we live in. But I'll
Yeah, you
sit
got to
there
pay your
and
rent.
yeah, and I'll answer questions all day. Where the podcast that I'm going to release, it's obviously people have to pay for Spotify. The clips on Instagram, I'm trying to do this at as low cost of entry as I can. And I think that that is, I don't want to use the term admirable for my own actions, but that is an example of I'm I'm standing on the hill. I'm not going to move from the hill. And one day, yeah, I might have an advertisement or two if I ever have the opportunity to do that. But that's in the same line of thinking. That's low cost. You can skip through that if you're listening, but I'm not going to create a Patreon and say, if you give me $10 a month, you get 30 extra minutes on the episode. That's not
Mm-hmm.
that's an abandonment of values that I have.
I
That I just
immediately unsubscribe to podcasts that do that. Just so you know, Sam Harris. And so yeah, I hear you, and I totally agree. Like, it's it's complicated because someone would come into this conversation and say to me, and you'd be like, "But you got to make a living." Yeah, you do. And there's certain things that should be held sacred. And so whether it's the desire to help people or the desire to share knowledge or whatever it is that we're both describe or you're describing and I'm concurring with, it's icky to ask for a lot, right? Because these aren't new ideas. That's the other thing I think I want to add to what you just said. It's like, I'm sure you're an amazing trainer and I might be a really good yoga teacher, but I'm not the first yoga teacher and you're not the first trainer. And so nothing about me is all that unique. People can learn the yoga poses from a book. They don't need me. So if they choose to come to me, I want to be a conduit and I want to be an accessible conduit, to your point. And I'm not in it to make $1 million, right? It's not a pursuit for me in life in general, but it's definitely not a pursuit in my yoga career. And so my yoga classes are ridiculously low cost for the same intention that you said, because I'm just interested in people having access to what can help them. We live in a time of unprecedented anxiety and depression and disconnection and health issues and so on and so forth. And so if me and you and other people like us have figured out just a teeny bit of a way to have a better life, to hold it behind cost barriers, to me is, I'm going to use the same word I already used, antithetical to the mission of, I figured something out and I want to share it.
Mm.
Yeah.
The name of this podcast is called Good People. We've asked every guest this question. I think you're an awesome person to ask this to. You've done a lot of self-reflection on yourself. You've done a lot of studying of how others live in the world, perceive themselves, pursue connectedness. What does it mean to you to be a good person?
I find this question so interesting. I mean, I think of a good person as someone who's in process. And what I mean by that is I don't think we are ever fully baked. I hope I'm never fully baked. I hope I leave this earth still baking, so to speak, to use a metaphor, because I don't ever want to think that I have the answers. And I don't ever want to think that I have it all figured out. Maybe I have a few little things figured out, but that should change. And so I see being a good person as being someone who's in a cycle of awareness, contemplation, reflection, action, right? So I am aware of myself and the impact that I have on the world, on the people around me. I am then contemplating that impact for good or for ill, right? Sometimes I'm an asshole, so is everybody, right? So in the moments that I'm an asshole, can I have awareness that I was an asshole and then make amends or, do the things that you do when you're an asshole? And then can I also have awareness that I did good to somebody, right? And not just be so self-deprecating to think that I'm, and that there's no positive impact that I'm making. So that's the awareness piece. And then the contemplation is like, well, think about it. Does this, going back to your values point, like, does this align? Am I behaving in a way that aligns to what I think is important in this world and in this life? And then reflecting on that and making changes therefore, if I am behaving in a way that is not in alignment with my values, then taking actions to get back into alignment. But that's a process, and it's a rinse repeat process. It's not, I don't believe it's something that you do and then you're done. You just become a good person, then you just are forever. So to be a good person to me is to go through those phases of, what is my ripple in this world? How can I make it the most aligned to what I think is important? For me, the least impactful in terms of negativity. Like I want to have the least impact on the environment, on other people in the negative sense as I possibly can. And so how do I do that? And just asking that question over and over and over again. If it's not daily, it's weekly, or it's whatever. So that's what I think.
Very cool.
And not being self-obsessed. That's one more.
Yeah.
We all are. That's the thing. It's like, we are all self-obsessed. This, again, is all about that. This is water that we were talking about with David Foster Wallace. The human condition is to be self-obsessed. But to transcend that, even temporarily, regularly, is to be a good person as well.
Cool. Get through all the shit and mud and have those brief moments. I think that that's a cool spot to end, where it's like, it's not, you can't, especially in our society, live like this all the time. And for some of us, it's literally just every once in a while, peeking your head out and taking that, okay, I got it. And then, you get pulled under again, and then you got to find your way back out and find that clarity, however you tend to do that. And everybody's
that's where
different.
The spiritual practices come in, right? So that to get us to go full circle, since we're near the end, it's like, well, how do I do that? How do I do the process of being a good person over and over again, so I keep trying to be a better person? Well, you find the practices, the paths, the rituals, the doctrines, whatever it happens to be, that brings you back, right? That grounds you again and again and again. And most of the time, my experience is that those things are way simpler than people make it out to be. You don't need an influencer. You might just need a long walk.
Yeah. Go run hard and see how you feel afterwards.
Yeah.
Cool. If people want to find more from you, where can they do that?
Well, to my dismay, I am on Instagram. No, I'm just joking. But I run something called the Boston Yoga School, and we have an online yoga studio. We transitioned online early in the pandemic. So that's one place to find yoga classes and so on. I also have my own personal Ame Wren yoga Instagram, where I, put other things on there. And then eventually I'm going to write a book. I don't know when that's going to happen, but I suppose the social media channels would be the way to find out. Oh, and there's a newsletter for my website. So there's a bunch of things.
Cool.
And if you go to JMU or UVA, you can take my class. You can take my academic class.
I'll include all that stuff in the show notes and things like that. And if you do write a book, definitely reach out. I would love to. Be very interested to look at that, read it, and maybe even have you on. This was a very cool conversation, and I'm grateful that you were willing to do it. And I would love to talk to you again. So that might be a good excuse to do that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored. I appreciate it.
Thank you guys so much for listening to this week's episode of Good People. If you guys are watching this episode on YouTube, please like, comment, and subscribe, and turn on post notifications so you never miss an episode. If you really want to help us out, please share this episode with somebody you love, perhaps your grandma. We'll see you next time.